So the question is, what are the common pitfalls in writing a literature review, and how do I avoid that? So Matthew, what are the key issues that students face in this space, and what can they do to address that?
Yeah, thanks, David. This is a very common question, one that we see a lot here at Grad Coach. And I think there's really two common pitfalls that I think are most common among my clients here at Grad Coach. And the first one is treating the literature review like an annotated bibliography. So rather than having a conversation with the literature, blending and synthesizing pieces of literature together into a coherent story and narrative, what we see a lot of times is almost a list of the literature. This researcher said this researcher found this study explains this. And that is a good first step on the process of creating a literature review. You have to get your literature together. You have to understand what each piece says before you can synthesize it. But really pushing ahead into that synthesis space where you're blending that literature together into a cohesive narrative, I think that is a very common challenge and pitfall that people fall into. And the second one I would say is accidental acts of plagiarism. This is something that I know stresses a lot of my clients out, especially in this era of AI plagiarism checkers, which are not super accurate and cause a lot of consternation for students and advisors alike. So here's my advice on that. When we read a paper, we paraphrase from the paper into our notes. Then when we go to write our literature, we paraphrase again from our notes into our literature review. So we're double paraphrasing everything that comes out of our literature. And usually, if you're following that, you're going to have success getting through those AI trackers on the back end.
Yeah, those AI trackers are problematic at the moment. I know we are struggling with it. Many of our clients are saying they're being flagged for AI, and other clients are saying, how do they avoid it? So it's definitely something that's a problem in the current space. But thanks so much, Matthew. I think the next question that we had, and this is a pre-submitted question as well, is really about how to go about the search strategy. And so the question is, how do I structure my search strategy for the general literature review, and how detailed must my search strategy be? So Matthew, what do we do to sort of develop a search strategy, and how do we effectively use it to find literature for our literature review chapter?
Yeah, so a few ideas here. The first thing we need to do is really craft a strategy. So take the time to do the planning phase up front before you ever open your internet browser. And what I want you to do is really two things up front. First, I want you to identify which databases are going to be most aligned to your work. So there are certainly general databases that your university subscribes to and has access to, but there are also many content-specific databases that might be more useful to you. For example, I said my degrees are in education, so I do a lot of work in the ERIC database. I have a lot of clients who are in the medical area, so they might be using PubMed as their first database. So process through and think about, is there a good content-specific database to get me started? And then the second thing I want you to do is create a list of keywords that are aligned to your topic. Remember that these databases are not as fluent and user-friendly as your like Google search or Bing or whatever search engine you use. They really are content specific. And a lot of times we are going to use old-fashioned content and keywords. So we might not be using the word we would use today to describe a phenomena, but we might be looking at an older version. So another example, from my professional work, I do a lot of work with students who are learning the English language while they're in school. Today, we would call those multilingual learners. That's sort of the vogue term to talk about in both the literature and in practice in education. However, if I'm going to do a study and I'm researching, I'm looking back and I'm going to use older terms like English language learner or ELL, which is a term we really haven't used in about 10 years in the practice side of things. But I need to use that older keyword to find it in the literature. So we're going to identify databases, we're going to identify keywords before we even start the process.
I think that's really helpful. And if you're struggling to figure out what are the keywords that I want to be using, take a look at papers that you found that are related to the topic and see what keywords they're using under the keyword section. That's going to be really helpful. You can also use some of your key concepts, your key constructs. Those are really going to be helpful. And in relation to finding a database as well, if you're struggling with that, then definitely reach out to your university librarian. That's their job, that's their focus point. They're going to know what databases are out there and what they are useful for. So definitely reach out to them as well. That's going to give you the maximum chance to find the databases that are most relevant to you. And the last thing that I might mention and add to what Matthew has said is don't forget to use some Boolean operators when you're developing your search terms as well. So make use of those and, ors, nots. Each database has a different structure to how they're used, but you can look at the advanced search function to get an idea of what are the options there and why we want to use those is it just helps us to get a bit more specific or a bit more broad. So for example, if you're using two concepts, English language learner and multilingual language learner, you might use an and then it will only search for papers that use both of those words. If you use an or, it will look for papers that use either option. So and always makes things tighter and or widens your search as well. And then it's all about putting that into practice, putting it down in a plan, and then using that plan as you go forward as well. So then we have a question on the live channel, and I think it's a really great one, and it's one that many of my clients have asked, and I'm sure many of your clients have asked. The question is, in reading a paper, do we have to read the entire paper, or do we focus on specific elements? So Matthew, how do we process a paper? How do we tackle that paper? What is the gold standard for how to read that paper?
Yeah, that's a great question and a super common one. Now, if we were all in residential PhD programs and this was all we were doing in our life, then I would say we're going to read every word of every paper. But most of us here in the grad coach environment are working professionals. We're adults with jobs and families and lives, and it just really isn't realistic to think I'm going to read every word of every paper and every journal in my field. So how do we break that down? I think that's a great question. So the first thing I always tell people to do is start with that abstract and read the abstract very carefully and ask yourself, does this abstract resonate with my research topic and my research question? If it does not resonate, it goes in the maybe for later pile. So we're going to kind of prioritize which articles we're going to read. We don't want to spend time reading articles that are clearly not aligned to what we're trying to do at the moment. Don't delete those, just put them in a different folder. You might need them later, but we're prioritizing our work. The second thing we're going to do is it kind of depends on what part of our literature review we're working on. So if we're still in that essential theory building phase where we're trying to really understand what does the current literature say about our problem, then I'm going to start by reading their literature review. It might not have a literature review heading. It might just say introduction. It might just dive right in. I'm going to read that section first because I'm still trying to wrap my head around the thinking and the conversations in this space. And so I'm going to read what other people have written about that first. And I might read 4 or 5 just literature review sections and then kind of put those papers in another folder for later to revisit once I get my head around the project. When I'm later in my literature review and I'm trying to make a case for maybe my study design, for my particular theory of action, I'm going to flip to the end of my study and I'm going to look at their methods. I'm going to look at their results to try to understand what did they do and what did they find. And I'm going to use that information to talk about why my study is relevant. And I also use that to help identify the gap in my study, because if I have a bunch of studies that are finding the same thing, but I have a different take or a different spin on it, that might help me justify the gap that I'm trying to fill with my dissertation. So always think about, what is the goal of my reading today? And I'm going to read the sections that match the goal of whatever that particular work session is. Never write a paper off. Never throw a paper in the recycling bin. Keep them all neatly sorted. I also tell my clients to build out a spreadsheet where they can track what papers they've read, what day they read them, and kind of why they read them, what they found, so that you can always have those notes to go back to and you don't end up in a madness cycle of rereading things that you've already looked at.
I think that's really great advice. That idea of focusing on what is the reason you're reading at that time. More often than not, at the start of your journey, you're going to be trying to find out what's happening in the field. So you'll be reading literature reviews, systematic reviews, narrative reviews. But when you're trying to make your point and trying to build an argument for your research, that's when you're going to focus much more later. And I think Matthew is right on the money there when it's really important to keep good notes while you're reading a paper. And as he mentioned earlier, it's all about having a catalog, a spreadsheet, whatever works for you. Some people also make use of their reference manager to track their notes as well. And so there are a range of tools that you can use, but the important thing is that you're consistent in their use. We actually have a few catalog examples that's accessible in our research toolkit. I'll put up the link for that a little later as well, so you can just take a look at those resources as well. And then really the other important thing to think about is when you are summarizing a paper for notes, you want to pull out the really key salient points. What did the research set out to do? How did they do it? What did they find? What were the limitations of the study? And then how does that relate to my study? And if you're making notes on the paper, pulling out those key salient points is going to really help you to build up a nice, strong base of literature that you can work with as well.
Yeah, I would just also say, don't forget to look at the reference lists at the end of the research as you're reading it, because that can really help jumpstart and make sure that you are getting a thorough scan of the literature. So we kind of think about how much is enough. That's a question we get asked a lot. And the answer I like to give is when you start to see the same people being cited in those references lists, that's when you've probably reached a critical mass for your field.
That pulls in really nicely with one of our pre-submitted questions, and I think you've just touched on it a little bit, but the question is, what is literature snowballing and how do I do it?
Yeah, so this is a great method, especially when you are struggling in the databases and you're just having a hard time getting through sort of the noise of the literature, because those databases, sometimes they can be really noisy. So here's kind of how I like to think about snowballing. And this is one of those things that I think every researcher maybe does it a little different. They have their own sort of flavor on how they do it. But here's how I approach it. I start with 10 articles. I find 10 articles that once I've read the abstract, I feel pretty confident that they are aligned to what it is that I'm working on. I read those articles, I take my notes, and as I'm reading, especially their literature review, I'm annotating off to the side. This article might align. This article might align. This article might align. I jump to the references list. I find those full citations, and then I go find those articles. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. And eventually what happens as we get through this process and we start to annotate and keep track of the different articles that we're pulling, we start to find that there really aren't any new ones, that we've really hit on all of the key core literature that people are citing and talking about. One caveat to this, and something to be very mindful of, is that snowballing effect is past literature. And we need to make sure that we have current literature in our dissertations as well. A lot of universities will set kind of arbitrary lines. No research can be older than 5 years, older than 10 years. That, in my view, is a little problematic because sometimes we need that seminal literature that's maybe 30 years old. I do a lot of work with self-efficacy theory and Bandura, and that literature is almost 50 years old now. But I always cite Bandura's original paper because it's that important. But anyway, we look backwards, but we need to make sure that we're getting that current literature too. So that's when we go back to our databases. We set those filters for last year, last 3 years, so we get that current stuff too. But just make sure as you're snowballing that you're tracking those years, that you're not getting things that are too old for your university's guidelines, and that you're still peppering in some of those 2020 and beyond articles into your process.
I think another thing that you can use to add to your snowballing to specifically help with that concept of snowballing, building up a base of older literature, is to take advantage of tools that exist out there that act as sort of paper networks. So ones that come to mind off the top of my head is Research Rabbit or Connected Papers. And these are tools where you can put a paper in and search for it, and it will then show you all the related papers. And that includes papers that have been published since. Another option, if you don't want to go the route of Research Rabbit or Connected Papers, is to just search for really relevant papers to your topic. And then in, for instance, Google Scholar, there is a small blue number there that says cited by. If you click on that, that will then show you all the papers that have, since that paper's been published, cited that paper. And that's a nice way to snowball forward in time as well. But again, if you're using Google Scholar, do be careful, because you've got to make sure you're using reputable papers from reputable journals as well. So they've got to have good citation ratings. They've got to be indexed in your databases as well. So always be careful when you're doing forward citation in something like Google Scholar. But that's really a key tool to helping you move forward in your snowballing, and then moving backwards through those reference list checks is really just going to enrich your content. And as Matthew said, there's going to be a point where you're going to say, why do I keep reading about Bandura? How many times is he going to come up? And that's a good sign that you've A, found a seminal paper if everyone is referencing him. And then B, if you start seeing it's just the same papers and you start not finding any new papers, that's a good sign that you're getting to a point of saturation and are ready to start synthesizing and working through those papers as well. Cool. So I think we'll go into one of our other pre-submitted questions, and this is a huge one, and one that's really important for students to think about before they tackle the literature review. And so the question is, what is the best way to organize your literature before writing the review? So Matthew, how do we go about putting together all that information that we've collected before we put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard?
Yeah. So I like to think about really two ways of structuring a literature review. And it kind of depends on what kind of study you're doing, what kind of dissertation you're building out. The first way to think about your literature review is a chronological orientation. So we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to find the oldest literature that we've got. We're going to talk about that literature first, and we're going to kind of sort it into buckets, into eras. And a lot of times there's pretty clear cut lines that you'll start to find about where those eras start to fall. So that's one good way to do that. If you're going to do that, I always recommend taking notes in a spreadsheet, because we can add other tags and filters and we can do that sort of thing. And so we're going to kind of tag our notes by era along the way. That way we can sort and get a very clear picture of what those eras look like. People often ask me, like, well, what do you mean by era? So you might have like pre-industrialization, the industrial era, the technology era, a post-COVID era, right? So being able to put things in spectrum. You might also have theory-based eras. And so you might have, here's sort of version A of this theory. Then this guy came in and made version B. Then this lady came in and made version C. So you could kind of structure them that way chronologically. Another way to structure your literature review is thematic. And so in a thematic review, what I kind of tell people to do is think about it almost like qualitative coding that you learned how to do in your qualitative methods class. So we take our notes, again, in a spreadsheet. That's how I like to do it. Then over in the next column, I'm going to kind of give a qualitative code to my notes that identifies different themes along the way. Then I can sort my literature by the themes and kind of think through, okay, I've got theme A, theme B, theme C. What order do these need to go in? How do I then move these into my paper? So if you really set yourself up front with a thoughtful and intentional note-taking process, then being able to sort of sort these out into categories and then place those categories in sort of an organizational flow becomes much simpler. The last thing I'll say is, don't feel like you're locked in to your organization. I have a lot of clients who come to me, they've spent a lot of time organizing, and then their advisor is like, no, none of this makes any sense. And so sometimes we have to get that round of feedback, understand what kind of organization our advisor has in their mind, how they're interpreting it, and then respond to that. And just remember that responding to that advisor feedback is part of the dissertation process. And so it's not something like, don't let that weigh you down. You're supposed to get critical feedback from your advisor. That's their whole purpose. And the whole reason for existing is to give you critical feedback to make your dissertation the best it can be. And just know that sometimes in organization, we have to do some cut and pasting. We have to move some things around.
I think that's really helpful. Chronological is very useful when you're looking at the development of a theory or a concept over time. The thematic is much more useful when you're looking at maybe multiple research constructs. So maybe you have self-efficacy and you have confidence. Those are the same thing. And you have two other constructs. So you might theme those into the constructs and then deal with each construct, and then synthesize those constructs together at the end and sort of talk about that. The other thing that's also important to think about when you're planning how to put your literature together is you want to be always pulling out your point. So you should be starting a chapter, paragraph, a section with a key point, then providing the evidence that supports that, and then integrating that with the rest of the literature and synthesizing it, the so what. And that's often enough in the literature review going to be pointing out the gaps in what the research that has already been done, what are the gaps, what are the limitations, and in a really good literature review, that's going to immediately point you towards why your research is necessary as well. And so always think about planning out your structure before you put pen to paper, but also, as Matthew said, don't get stuck on that structure as well. Let it, build it out, set it up, and then write it. Then read your draft, see how that flow goes. And if the flow isn't smooth or isn't connecting nicely, then you can make modifications as well. But writing is an iterative process, and academic writing all the more so. So get used to going back and changing things and adjusting things and responding to the feedback from your supervisor. It's never one draft and you're done. And if it is, then I'm really impressed and well done for that, because I will say when I was doing my dissertation, I had way too many iterations and drafts that I had to run through. Cool. So then I guess another question, and I kind of touched on this already. This is a pre-submitted question that came through. But the question is about flow and narrative development through the literature review. Many clients that we've worked with will talk about, I've got all the points, but how do I put that together into something that actually sounds good and reads well? So the question is, I'm having trouble making the pieces of the literature review flow, both together and within my master's thesis. What tips do you have for improving narrative flow in a literature review?
So when I have clients who are struggling with this, the exercise I always do is storyboarding. So thinking about how we would tell a story, how you would, if you were writing a novel, if you were writing a screenplay, pulling out some storyboard templates, which you can find online pretty easily, and blocking out, I'm going to talk about this, then I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to talk about this, and making sure that you're telling a story through your literature review. A lot of times when we're in this academic writing space, people forget that your writing has to be readable. It has to tell the reader what they need to know to understand your context. And so if we get so focused on kind of academic tone, which is important, and I'm not saying we don't use that, but we get so focused on that we then end up losing the story of our literature review. And a well-crafted literature review does both. It maintains that level of academic rigor, but it tells a cohesive story, a cohesive narrative for the reader to follow. And so pulling out a storyboarding exercise, really going through and asking yourself, does it make sense to talk about this in this space? Does it make sense to talk about this first or this first? I'll give you another example from my professional practice. I do a lot of work with federal education policy in the United States, particularly related to school improvement and accountability. So I will talk about maybe Title I schools, and I will talk about No Child Left Behind policy. And I have to decide every paper that I write, which do I talk about first? because the two things are related. The two things influence each other, but they don't always come in the same order in every paper that I'm writing, because ultimately they need to come in the order that's best for the reader to be able to understand my question and my study. So going back to what I said at the beginning, an old-fashioned storyboarding exercise like you did in English 102, Creative Writing 101, back in your bachelor's program can really help you get unstuck with this problem.
That's really helpful. The other bit of advice that I'll give is make or take advantage of linking sentences. So if you're struggling at the paragraph level flow, always think about, what can I end my current paragraph with that signals to the reader what the next paragraph is going to be about? And you want to put in those linking sentences at the end of each of your paragraph that connects the idea from paragraph 1 to the idea from paragraph 2. More broadly as well, you can think about the structure of the literature review. And I always like to use the sort of image of an inverted pyramid. You're going to be starting broad, general, high-level coverage, and you're going to slowly start pulling your way in to get more specific, more detailed, more close to your topic and specific research question. And so if you're struggling with that narrative flow, take a step back and just look at your paragraph structure and how you're presenting the information, and make sure you're going from broad to specific and that you're clearly linking ideas. And the last bit of advice I will give is get someone else to read your draft as well. It's always going to be helpful to find out where are the sticking points. We all have our blind spots. We've written this, it's our baby, we've raised it, we've groomed it, we have blind spots. So getting an outside reader is always going to be helpful, whether that's a friend, a cohort member. You can also look at coaching services. We offer content reviews as well. But these are really opportunities to get an outside perspective to make sure that you are making a smooth narrative flow as well.
David, can I add just one more thing to that? So also consider your dissertation handbook, because some universities do provide a pretty strict outline for what needs to be in your literature review and the order that it needs to come in. This I found is especially true for technical programs and for some sort of working professional programs that are in like engineering kinds of programs, things like that. So make sure that you're following the guidelines in your dissertation handbook. That's one place where I would say don't get creative. If the handbook says A, B, and C, that's what your literature review has to look like. Even if it doesn't make narrative sense to you, it has to match what's in that handbook. So make sure you check that too before you get too far down the road.
We have a question from Steph that came in, and it's a quick fire one. We are coming up to the end of our time for the session, but Matthew, the question is, what are key terms I can use in my synthesis section? So what are the terms that we can use when we're trying to compare and connect studies and see what they're saying?
Yeah, so your synthesis section is really about debating the literature and helping the reader to understand what different pieces of literature are saying about your issue. So we're going to use compare and contrasting language. We're going to use maybe supporting language if we can say this author also supports this idea because blah, 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 blah. So we want to be thinking about how do we weave this together. And this is a good time to kind of think about, how would I just say this to somebody? I always think the synthesis section is the most sort of conversational. So I will sometimes have clients who are struggling to kind of put this together, to get their phone out, some recording device, and to hit record and just talk through the synthesis. And then you can listen to that back and you could hear those keywords because they're going to come out very conversationally as you explain your synthesis out loud. And then we can take that more conversational tone and put it into academic tone.
That's really good advice. The other bit of advice, if you don't want to record yourself and listen to yourself, just have a friend chat to you about your research. Ask them to ask you about your research. And then you can start to connect those ideas. And once you find those connections, then it's just about using the synonyms there. So look up a synonym list and you can use words like, these studies together show that. These studies find X when other studies find Y. And an important part about synthesis is it's not just indicating that that comparison exists, but it's sort of digging a little bit deeper. Why does that comparison exist? Why is there a difference between what studies are finding? That's what's really going to take your synthesis up another level in terms of critical analysis as well. I'm going to ask one or two more quick-fire questions from the chat. So Louise has asked, my study has very limited peer review literature, but has a lot of gray literature. How do I handle this? So Matthew, what can we do in situations where there isn't necessarily a ton of academic literature on the topic, but lots of industry notes, white papers? What's the strategy here?
Yeah, this is a great one. I work with a lot of gray literature in my field because public education is government regulated, right? So my publications almost always have citations to gray literature, to government documents, to guidance documents, to regulation, to law. So the first thing is, I think it's always very important in our literature review that we're bifurcating between the peer review literature and the gray literature. So at some point in your review, you're going to talk about here's the peer review side of things. And then you're going to say, here's the rest of it. And even within that gray literature, I might couple together the law and regulation into one section. And then I might do non-regulatory guidance in a section. Then I might do professional literature. So from like not the journals, but the magazines, right, that come with a professional field. And so we'll break those up again into individual sections. So it's very clear to the reader that you understand, less to the reader, more to the evaluator, that you understand the difference between that peer review literature and the rest of it. You know, gray literature, a lot of people think is just bad and that we should stay away from it. But especially if you're dealing with a state or federally regulated field or topic area, you must include that gray literature. Any publication about public education, about social work, about industry, even like if you're working in the automotive industry or the airline industry that are heavily regulated, those must include some conversation of the policy landscape. And gray literature is where you're going to find that. It is always better, in my opinion, to cite a regulation and say this regulation says X, Y, and Z, than to cite a person who cited the regulation and say, this author says that this regulation says, right? We want to go straight to the source. So don't get freaked out about gray literature. Just make sure that you're bifurcating it into individual sections so that the evaluators understand that you understand the difference.
This also is quite true in business studies. If you're doing an MBA, DBA, you're often going to be looking at sort of industry papers. And while those are sort of halfway between an academic paper and a white paper, they are still important and beneficial. And they're going to be particularly useful in terms of collecting data on what are the current trends, what are the situation in progress. And so definitely don't hide away from that gray literature, but always make sure that you do have some academic backing as well. Even if it's to say, this is what is in the academic space and it is very limited, therefore there is a need for more academic research. And that's a great way to sort of pull yourself forward in terms of the coverage. I see we've just got one more question that I'd like to hit before we close up here, and that's from Christian. And he said, what are your thoughts on the Peel method? He's looking for a systematic way to synthesize because at the moment he's struggling with just lists. So I guess the question in short is, Matthew, what are your thoughts on the Peel method? And also, what is it for those who don't know?
Yeah, so the Peel method, Peel stands for point, evidence, explanation, and link. And it's a way to sort of structure your literature review together. So we're going to sort of start with a topic sentence. We're going to put in our evidence. We're going to evaluate what that evidence says. And then we're going to link it to the next paragraph, link it to our larger research topic in question. So I think that this method can be very effective if you're really struggling to kind of get your literature in order. But what I always tell people is that I would only use the Peel method for my rough draft. I'm not going to cling to that long term, because what can happen with the peel method is kind of what I mentioned at the start of this, where we start to get very listy, very annotated bibliography kind of a vibe. And so that's caution number one. Caution number two is that also sometimes under the peel method, paragraphs can get very long. I've seen people use this method and all of a sudden a paragraph is like 2.5 pages, which is clearly too long. And so that's why I say use this to rough draft, to get the thoughts out of your brain onto the computer screen. I think it's a great tool there. But then I want you to go back through, and I want you to think about all the rest of the tips that we've given in this discussion. Think about the readability, think about the organization, think about the flow. Make sure that we're not just listing. And kind of in your round two, let's start to break some of those chunks up so that we go from a very structured peel method paragraph into a more coherent narrative.
Thanks so much, Matthew. Unfortunately, we are coming up to the end of our available time. So I'd love to take this opportunity to thank Matthew for giving us so much insight into the literature review. And then for those of you who didn't necessarily get your question answered or are looking to get some support and coaching, we have a team of coaches who are here to provide tailored guidance, private coaching as well. So you can book a free consultation using the QR link there or that link there. You're also welcome to just go to the Grad Coach website and click on Get Started. And then other than that, thank you so much for joining, everyone. It's been great having you asking questions and for engaging with us. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. And thank you for your time, Matthew.